So I'm going to pick up a little bit before where we stopped in class, just to kind of bring you back into the discussion of masochism as a personality type. And we stopped with an example from Nancy McWilliams about what Freud referred to as the repetition compulsion. And this was basically Freud talking about hypothesizing that for a variety of technical reasons, one of the things that often necessitates psychotherapy is that we appear to repeatedly, unconsciously, without consciously intending to, we repeatedly kind of immerse ourselves in circumstances similar to those that produced some sort of complication in our lives or even trauma in our lives. It's almost as if we're going back and we're seeking out an opportunity to fix things that were problematic for us in the past. So that's, I'm oversimplifying it to some degree. There's more to it than that, but for our purposes, that's the gist of what Freud characterized as a repetition compulsion. Nancy McWilliams gave us the example of a patient who, and I'll quote from McWilliams, I read this in class at the end, right at the very end of class. One of her patients used to announce her latest financial extravagances to her frugal, obsessive-compulsive husband whenever their relationship began to feel warm and comfortable. This would reliably send him into a fury. McWilliams and the patient figured out together that this provocative habit revealed an unconscious conclusion that the patient had drawn as a child, that whenever things are calm, a storm is about to break. When her marriage was going well, she would unconsciously worry that, like her explosive father, her husband was about to destroy their happiness with an outburst. She was thus behaving in a way that she viscerally knew would bring it on in order to get it over with and begin a pleasant interlude. So hopefully this brings you back up to where we were at the end of class last time. I think I mentioned the fact that this is a pretty good representation of some of the dynamics that people with masochism find themselves in relationships, and that I don't know what the data is on this. My anecdotal experience clinically and my supposition based on these theories would be that most people with masochistic tendencies in their personalities probably are dealing with dynamics similar to this, in the sense that rather than it being a moral masochism like we talked about at the beginning of our class last time, and if you don't recall that, just go back in your slides. It's one of the first few slides there. Rather than being a moral masochism, generally what you find people who have strong masochistic tendencies to be dealing with is this desire to kind of precipitate suffering because it's better than an alternative, or because they anticipate the suffering is going to happen anyway and they want to precipitate it so they can get it over with. These are not unusual dynamics at all. In terms of object relations for people who have strong or pronounced masochistic tendencies in their personality, you see pretty consistently, and this first bullet point here, you can think of this about this as being particularly the case in situations where you do see kind of a moral masochism, that the masochism puts the person in a position of being a sympathetic character, of being a noble character, frankly, often. The person who finds him or herself married to somebody who is obviously undeserving of them, that they're good, devoted spouse. The masochist is a good, devoted spouse who cares about their neglectful or even abusive spouse, and never wavers, no matter how cruel or neglectful or whatever the treatment from the more abusive or the problematic spouse might be. So there you can see where in that circumstance there's a payoff. There's a benefit to being in this position. You get to be the good guy. And not uncommonly, one of the other purposes that such a dynamic serves is related to that moral masochism that we were talking about, or I was talking about in the prior slide and at the beginning of last class. This dynamic allows you not only to be the good guy, but also to feel relief for assumed, sometimes inaccurately assumed, misbehavior or failing. In the classic example of that, you can see this dynamic develop during childhood following divorce. In fact, it's a very common sort of a thing. It's not unusual at all for children after a divorce to begin to act out. They do things to get in trouble. They seem angry. They seem irritable. They make impulsive decisions, etc. There's a number of variables. One of the variables that doesn't have anything to do with masochism, but I'm going to tell you anyway, is that we'll use the classic example of three-person family, mommy, daddy, little boy, or little girl, doesn't really matter. Mommy, daddy, kid. I saw this most frequently with little boys, but it can happen with both sexes. Dad leaves, has an affair. They get a divorce. Dad leaves. They're trying their best. This dissolved couple now is trying their best, and so they do share some custody. And the kid visits dad on the weekends and stuff. And when he visits dad on the weekends, he's well behaved, and he comes home and he's just a little butthead when he's home with his mom. He makes life really difficult. He's angry at mom. He acts out. A lot of emotional ups and downs, and he's misbehaving at school, and but dad's not getting any of this. And one of the dynamics behind this is that there is anger experienced toward one or both parents, perhaps accurately in this case, and one of the cases that I had with this dynamic was established. The kid deep down inside kind of knew what had happened. He was 7 maybe, and he didn't understand enough what was going on that he really could put his finger on it, but he knew dad had done something bad. And he had the sense, which was pretty accurate, that dad had abandoned the family. And he was angry at dad, but the problem is dad had already demonstrated a willingness to walk away. In that circumstance, it wasn't safe for the kid to be overtly mad at dad. But the anger was still there. And like anger generally does, needed to be discharged. If you just sit with it and simmer, nothing changes. So one of the ways of dealing with it is to get rid of it, to express it somehow. And what ended up happening is this kid, which then this happens frequently, directed the anger toward the one person he knew could take it, and that was mom. He knew mom wasn't going to leave him. He felt much more confident and safe with her, and so she ended up bearing the brunt of the anger that actually was felt toward the dad. So that's one example of how acting out, or what a source of acting out in kids after a divorce. But you get another dynamic which is directly connected to the masochism piece here, where kids make an assumption, this is not unusual at all, make an assumption that they were somehow responsible for the dissolution of the marriage. And to be frank, there are circumstances, not infrequently, where the kid believes this because mom and or dad have either directly stated it or implied it, that somehow the kids were the stressor, were the straw that broke the camel's back. You know, that something connected with the kid's misbehavior or whatever was actually what made the marriage fail. Almost inevitably, that's BS, but parents do sometimes say those kinds of things to kids. Sometimes in a fit of passion, and something comes out of their mouth that they wish they hadn't said. Sometimes very intentionally. Sometimes they don't say anything at all, but the kid, for one reason or another, develops this belief. And as a result, you get this dynamic of a moral masochism where the kid, in order to get some relief from the sense of guilt that they're carrying around, that I'm the one who caused this marriage to dissolve, misbehaves and elicits appropriate punishment for the misbehavior and can get some relief from their guilty conscience. The background and history for people who have strong masochistic characteristics to their personality is fairly similar to that for people who have depression, unresolved loss, grief, whether that's real or symbolic or mistaken, you know, where there wasn't actually an absence, but the kid perceived an absence, those kinds of things. Not infrequently, there is a dynamic where the child who eventually becomes the adult with masochistic tendencies is positioned to feel responsible for the caregivers, for the parents, for the rest of the family. The caregivers tend to use guilt as a behavior management tool. See what you're doing to me. And again, because part of this is because depressives tend to raise depressives and masochists tend to raise masochists. Some of this is probably genetic. There's probably some degree of genetic, there's almost certainly a degree of genetic disposition here. But also the behavior toward the child is such that it would tend to shape depression or masochism. If you're using guilt as a primary strategy to manage a child's misbehavior or get a child to do what you want them to do, essentially what you're teaching them is a self-image in which they are the bad guy, and you got to find some way of coping with that. You got to find some way of getting yourself out of that position. One good way of getting yourself out of that position, again, this generally happens unconsciously, the person doesn't even know they're doing it, but if you're the bad guy, one way to get yourself out of that position is to position yourself in such a way that somebody else is mistreating you such that objectively they're the bad guy. Now, relatively, you're the good one, you're the innocent, relatively innocent victim to somebody who's mistreating you. In the case of masochism, often because you have in some way positioned the relationship or provoked the relationship such that that you can be the victim of this mistreatment. And then, of course, one of the things that you see in people who are pretty impaired in the masochistic sense and or severe in the depressive sense is that they often have backgrounds characterized by physical, emotional, and sometimes sexual abuse. Although if you have a florid history of that kind of abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual, the likelihood is you're going to be trending more toward the kind of borderline characteristics. It isn't unusual, though, to see in masochists and depressives kind of a milder, more indirect neglectfulness, emotional abuse, kind of subtle or sometimes not so subtle verbal hostility, these kinds of things, and sometimes physical abuse, but usually not real severe. If it's real severe, it tends to cause sufficient problems that perhaps you don't even think of these people in terms of masochism or depression. You might instead be looking at borderline characteristics. One way you sometimes hear people talk about masochism relative to depression as personality structure is the idea that the masochist is essentially the depressive who hasn't given up hope of being loved. It's an interesting way of conceptualizing it. I would probably put it a little differently. The idea behind it, the idea that the masochist is thinking in terms of maybe if I'm seen as suffering, maybe if I'm seen as somebody in need of saving, there will be somebody who will come to my rescue. But I would disagree with it because it implies that somehow the depressive character doesn't have hope of being loved. I would say that their mechanisms for going about seeking to secure love, both of whom, both the masochist and the depressive, sees it as unlikely. They see themselves in respective ways as being somewhat undeserving of fulfilling love. Where the depressive character, the healthy depressive character, the unhealthy depressive character very often has essentially given up hope. They're lonely, they're closed down, they are depressed, right? The healthy depressive character is more likely to see themselves as at worst undeserving, or perhaps profoundly fortunate, really lucky that they managed to find somebody who will love even them, and they'll work very, very hard to try to deserve that love that they fundamentally deep down inside feel like they probably don't deserve. Depressive character. Masochistic character is, on the unhealthy end of things, is like what's being described on the slide here. You know, if I'm suffering badly enough, maybe somebody will feel for me enough, they'll feel enough empathy for me, that they will rescue me, that they will take care of me, and then that will qualify. That is a kind of love, sort of. On the healthy end of the masochism, it is, I will do anything to warrant being loved. I will put other people's needs before mine, even to the point of suffering. And you can see at the healthy end where that almost starts to shade into how the depressive character begins to approach it. And bear in mind, we're making distinctions here between categories that often overlap. You know, it's not, you can have a depressive character who has masochistic characteristics, and you can have a masochist who has depressive characteristics. So we're somewhat artificially distinguishing these things, although you do see people who are pure depressives and people who are pure masochists. So, but you see the distinction between the masochist who sees their claim to affection and love and permanence as being predicated upon their willingness to suffer if necessary, and as they're less healthy, less insightful, they may even see the suffering as necessary in order to warrant being loved. The depressive character is more kind of, I'm going to chase it. I'm going to do everything I can to deserve it. I'm going to be as good as I can possibly be. And they may try to hide some of the characteristics they see as making them less deserving of love. But more frequently, they're more open about it and will work very, very hard to overcome those things. But the characteristic for in a relationship for somebody with a strong masochistic quality to their personality structure is essentially that they become worthy of love by suffering in a variety of ways, and we've talked about some of those ways last class period and a little bit today. That it's the suffering itself that makes them eligible, so to speak, to be loved. I think I've already made some reference to the family dynamics, the childhood family dynamics of of people with masochistic character structure. But I'll just revisit this real quickly in case I missed any of this. One of the very clear dynamics that you see in the families of origin for people with who have masochistic structure is that they come from environments where warmth and affection is, for whatever reason, relatively limited. And it might not be that the parents don't care. Certainly, in most cases, it's not that the parents don't care. It's that they are otherwise preoccupied. They're very, very busy with work, or there are other circumstances. Maybe there's maybe you got a kid who has a sibling who is on the autistic spectrum and needs a tremendous amount of support and help. So the non-autistic child, who ultimately, maybe in this case, develops some degree of masochistic structure, eventually learns unconsciously, may not be aware of it, but comes to discover that the parents, who are basically good human beings and they want to be decent parents, but who are overwhelmed with caring for this other child who has extraordinary needs, they attend most intimately, most strongly, most warmly toward the neurotypical child, the non-autistic child, when something bad has happened, and then they jump and they want to take care of that child, or when the kid is being disruptive or whatever. That's when they get the attention, and so inadvertently they're teaching a child, perhaps from a very, very young age, that if you want warmth and affection, or if you want attention at all, something bad has to have happened, or you need to be disruptive in some way, etc. Further, what you often see in these families is that the person's ability to tolerate suffering is recognized, perhaps is even praised and encouraged. They're seen as special in their capacity to tolerate, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Bad things happen to them, and perhaps they're given affection and warmth, and the parents, who are already in our imaginary situation, who are already overwhelmed, really give them credit for how, you're doing such a good job. You're such a brave person, and they're really attended to and they're really praised in these circumstances. Not inevitable in the families of origin, but very common. One of the other things that isn't in and of itself a factor, so you don't have to be like, oh my gosh, if I ever tickle my child, I'm going to create a masochistic character. Not the case. But one of the things that you do tend to see, and it's just in the backgrounds of people with masochistic character, is that they'll talk about memories of being tickled to the point of almost passing out, and it's this weird overlay of, I'm getting affection, but I'm suffering. And it's not so much that the tickling itself is magic. It certainly isn't. It's that it's just a symptom of a family dynamic. The tickling is characteristic, and it stands out in their memory because, if you've been tickled before, and I hope you have, that it's this weird combination, right? It's not pleasant, but it is pleasant. In fact, sometimes kids will come to you and they'll ask to be tickled, right? So there's a pleasant component to it, and that is probably the affection. And of course, there's laughter involved in everything, but there's also a sense of helplessness and unpleasantness, and especially when you get to a certain point where the person no longer wants that anymore. One of the things you see in histories, in families of origin for people with masochistic structure, is that dynamic of being tickled, and there's the affection and the happiness that's associated, but it doesn't stop when the person wants it to stop. Again, not diagnostic, is not the thing that causes it, but that's one of those, kind of, oh, this is interesting. We tend to see this in these situations. A last couple of notes about the object relations, the relationships of people with masochistic structure. One is that while this is not characteristic for all personalities, narcissists don't necessarily seek out other narcissists. Depressives don't necessarily seek out other depressives. And antisocial personalities or psychopaths don't necessarily seek out other psychopaths. They tend to seek out people who are complementary to them. The masochist, while that may be the case, that they seek out some complementary personality structure, somebody who's not a masochist but who somehow fits with them well, they may seek that out in their romantic life. They tend to find themselves, unfortunately, to be prey of people who are sadistic and people who have strong control needs. See people like antisocial personalities and psychopathic or sociopathic personalities in their romantic lives. In their friendships, in their associations, they might tend to instead seek out other masochists because those people understand me. They can relate to one another in their suffering. So that's somewhat unique. And then, of course, there is the situation. The relatively common situation of somebody who is generally psychologically healthy, who gets involved in a relationship with a masochist and finds themselves being fairly mean or inconsiderate or neglectful of the masochist when they wouldn't characteristically behave that way in a relationship. And it's largely because the masochist is essentially provoking some of that in the relationship. I don't want to give you the misimpression that I'm saying that, a woman who suffers domestic abuse is bringing it on herself. That is not what I am saying in any way. What I am saying, though, is some people in domestic abuse situations are in domestic abuse situations because of masochistic tendencies. Most of the time, it isn't that the person who's hurting them is a psychologically healthy person. Most of the time, instead, it's somebody who's relatively sadistic or psychopathic or some otherwise controlling, and is being provoked in some way by the masochist in an attempt to elicit love. And frankly, oftentimes that is kind of what happens. The person abuses the masochist, and then if they're not a psychopath, and even if they are a psychopath, they might manipulatively then feel tremendous regret and do nice things for them to make up for it, to keep the masochist from abandoning the relationship. But there are circumstances where the masochist gets involved with somebody who is fundamentally psychologically healthy, but who acts out against the masochist, mistreats the masochist in a way that wouldn't be characteristic of them in other relationships. Yeah, I won't say any more about that. Just I want to make sure people don't misunderstand me. I am not saying that people who are in abusive situations bring it on themselves as a rule. In most cases, that is not the case. In some cases where masochism is a factor, it is a variable. That's just the truth. And I'll put it a slightly different way, a much more straightforward way. And I may have said this in class. If you have somebody who finds themselves involved in a single abusive relationship, including in circumstances where they can't get out of it for a variety of reasons, that may just be that may just be an accident, an unfortunate circumstance that can take a lot of time and effort to extract the person from. If they find themselves involved in a subsequent relationship, so now they've been in 2 relationships that are abusive, physically, emotionally, sexually, or some combination of the 3. Now we have what is at least a coincidence. You get involved in 3 relationships. Now you got a pattern. And the common denominator is the individual who's been involved in those three relationships. That is not to say that they are responsible for the abuse. No, if somebody hits you, the person who's responsible for the hitting is the person who hit you. But this is important in doing psychotherapy. I think I may have mentioned this, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself. I may have mentioned this when we actually were talking about this in person. One of the things that's important when you're doing psychotherapy with somebody who's a masochist is not to shy away from the possibility that they are in fact inadvertently putting themselves repeatedly in these situations, because if that is the case and they don't recognize it, they're never going to fix it, right? So I know that's a politically incorrect thing to say, but that doesn't make it untrue. Okay, I've made this point a couple of times now. There's the big overlap, or substantial overlap, between people who are masochists and masochistic structure and depressive structure. You see this in self-concept. People who are depressive in character and masochistic in character tend to share the dynamic that they perceive themselves as unworthy. They struggle with kind of disproportionate guilt. Like, I don't know why I feel so guilty, but I do. I feel like it's my fault. They often perceive themselves consciously or unconsciously as deserving of rejection or punishment. Of course, the difference there is that the depressive doesn't provoke it or seek it out. The masochist does. They both see themselves as needy, mostly because they perceive themselves as unworthy. So they're constantly kind of reaching out to want to be cared for, loved, taken care of, these kinds of things. Generally, they both masochists and depressives feel incomplete or inadequate. To make a distinction, somebody who's a narcissist also has that sense of inadequacy, but generally speaking, they hide that from themselves. They ignore it. They pretend like it's not the case, and in fact, they focus on the opposite. I'm completely adequate. I'm wonderful. Whereas for the masochist and the depressive, that inadequacy, that sense of inadequacy, is central. They're very aware of it. They lament it on a regular basis. They struggle with it. And both masochists and depressives tend to have this sense of as if they are fated, as if they're doomed to be neglected and misunderstood and underappreciated, if not unappreciated. So you get that shared dynamic. The thing that distinguishes the masochist from the depressive is that the masochist takes this negative stuff and projects it onto people around them, and then they behave in such a way that those people act negatively toward them, right? So the masochist oftentimes, frankly, will seek out relationships with people who perhaps are genuinely inadequate. I had a woman that I worked with when I was in private practice who had fairly pronounced masochistic tendencies, and she found herself repeatedly involved in relationships with men. How do you put this? She found herself repeatedly involved in relationships with men who were a 5 out of 10, not particularly attractive, not well employed, not somebody that was really a very impressive person. This woman was remarkably attractive, made a 6-figure salary, and when I was in private practice, was about 15 years ago, she made a good salary. At that, in the dollar of that day, she was making very good money. Bright, funny, attractive woman. I'd say a solid 8.5, 9 out of 10. Somebody that if you saw her, you'd say, oh, that's an attractive person. Consistently finding herself involved with people who everybody around her would say, why are you with him? And the dynamic that appeared to be the case was that inadequacy, and oftentimes she found herself involved with people who were resentful of their circumstances. And so she would get involved in these relationships with these people that she unconsciously, if you confronted her about it, she would argue with you and say, no, 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 and she would focus on all these things that frankly were realistic attributes, realistic positive attributes that this person had, but she would ignore all of the inadequacy, or explain it away in some way. But then she would, in the relationship, she would unconsciously at first, and of course that part of the therapy was to help her become aware of this, she would provoke the person and create circumstances where they were mean to her. They would become resentful if they were attracted to her, and they would see it as, wow, I got this beautiful woman who makes a lot of money who's dating me, and who for some reason likes me, but they were also struggling with the resentment of her, and frankly, some of the resentment was legitimate because in a way she was using them, and so they would mistreat her, and then she got to be the good guy. She got to be the one who everybody around her would feel bad for her, and kind of there was like a flurry of oh honey, you're so much better than that. Like she got all this positive feedback from everybody, from her family and her friends and everything, and she got to be the noble one who would stand by this guy, But that was a good example of this. That is not so characteristic of a depressive. That is characteristic of the masochist, who they put themselves in a position to suffer because for any of a variety of reasons, the suffering produces something desirable or allows them to avoid something truly undesirable. And in this woman's case, what it was, the reason why she was seeking out these men is because fundamentally she didn't believe that an 8, a guy who was as intelligent as her, as attractive, as physically attractive as her, as personally attractive, because she was a very likable person. She didn't fundamentally believe that that guy would be interested in her, right? So, and if she did happen to get involved with somebody like that they would ultimately mistreat her and leave her. Whereas if she got involved with somebody, this was later on in the therapy that she came to this realization that, wow, I'm seeking guys that I believe won't be able to leave me because they can't do better than me. And she was mortified when she came to this realization. Again, a good person, but just slowly found herself in this dynamic, and it was a function of the masochistic kind of core that she was wrestling with. Sometimes you get people talking about how this tendency to project their badness onto other people. When we're going to talk about paranoid character in the next lecture, we're going to talk about the last two that we're going to talk about this semester are obsessive-compulsive and paranoid. When we talk about paranoid, one thing we're going to talk about is that's what paranoids do, is they project their badness onto other people, and we'll talk about what happens after that. But the difference is that when the paranoid projects the badness on other people, that allows that provokes in the paranoid the urge to retreat. I want to get away from this person because they're somehow threatening to me, or they're perceived as threatening to the paranoid. The masochist does the opposite. They project it and then they seek that person out. They seek connection with that person, and that allows them. That they create in that person, and I think this is language from McWilliams, if I remember right, they create in that person a repository for self-directed sadism. So they get the person, often unconsciously, they position the person to treat them in ways in which their suffering becomes an asset. And then last point about self-concept. When you have somebody whose masochism has a strong moral bent, a strong moral flavor, so to speak, to it, one of the things that becomes apparent is this quality of indignance. That their suffering puts them in a category where they are better than other people. They develop a sense of themselves as superior on the basis of the suffering they're willing to undergo because it's the right thing, right? And there, again, in all of this, there's a healthy and there's an unhealthy expression of it. You get somebody who is, I don't know that I would be willing to stand by this. I'll put this out here tentatively, and I reserve the right to withdraw it. Perhaps Mother Teresa, somebody who put herself in a position of suffering over the course of most of her life in order to serve others who are suffering even more. But she took on the suffering, and in taking on the suffering, quite literally became a saint. She was made a saint by the Catholic Church. Because of her willingness and perhaps her need and a personality, in the sense of personality, to accept suffering to serve those who are suffering even worse. So I'm not criticizing this. I'm not saying that that's psychologically unhealthy. I'm saying that's fundamentally masochistic in nature. And it may have actually been healthy and certainly a moral good. And I don't know if she saw herself as superior. From what I understand about her, she probably didn't. She was known as a very humble person, but it did put her in the position of being kind of morally admirable, which is requisite for sainthood, right? The less healthy masochist does so in more of a self-serving manner, where that suffering allows them to feel special about themselves. And again, this can be characteristic for masochism in general. It's more pronounced when it's that moral masochism. Okay, as with all of these, there's so much more we could talk about around the personality, but I'm going to draw the line there, and I'll come back with another lecture on obsessive-compulsive structure and paranoid structure, and those will be the last two that we'll have time to cover for this semester.